Hello and welcome to That Bible Guy and the continuation of your series on the book of Mark. Today we're coming to Mark chapter 8, remembering God's past faithfulness. So remembering God's past faithfulness. I don't know about you, but so often I just seem to forget things. Maybe more as I get older. I don't really want to admit that. But sometimes you just can't remember the important things that you wish you could remember. And then you realize, oh my goodness, I wish I'd remembered that. You get caught short. Even this weekend, my 13-year-old daughter Sophie, we were watching. She wanted to watch a movie. I think we wanted to watch Hercules, so she knew I might like it. The guy about strength. But she put it on, and she's like, "Remember this, Dad?" I was like, "I don't remember watching this at all." For some reason, I can never remember what I go to see in the cinema. I don't remember movies. If I've written text is written down, I tend not to forget it. But movies and that, for some reason, I'm not like the younger generation. I just forget things, and I was having to defend myself to her and saying, "Hold on a minute, I don't have dementia. I just don't remember this." She couldn't understand this. But sometimes there are things we wish we could remember in life, and sometimes, to be honest, it is vital that there are certain things we must remember. Whilst we have the cognition to be able to do that, it's really important to remember God's past faithfulness. We're going to see in Mark chapter 8 here, Jesus fed the 4,000. But then he has an interaction with the Pharisees. Well, they ask for a sign. And Jesus then says in verse 12, "Why does this generation ask for a sign? No sign will be given to it." So he has the Pharisees interaction, another interaction with the Pharisees. And then he goes on to explain something in verse 14. He says the disciples had forgotten to bring bread, except for one loaf that they had with them in the boat. "Be careful," Jesus warned them. "Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod." They discussed this with one another and said, "It's because we have no bread." Aware of their discussion, Jesus asked them, "Why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see, and ears but fail to hear? And don't you remember? When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many basketfuls did you pick up?" 12, they replied. "And when I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many basketfuls did you pick up?" They answered, 7. He said to them, "Do you still not understand?" Seems to be quite serious with the guys here, and some people say, "I wish we had his tone here just to see what his tone was." But we know Jesus done everything in love. But certainly it was a challenging tone. We can imagine from the questions that he gives to his followers here. They brought one loaf, and Jesus said, "Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod." Now, what Jesus is referring to is that yeast that builds up in the bread insidiously, almost without even noticing it. It was the teaching and the hypocrisy of the Pharisees. He knew that they went round with flowing robes, wanting the most important seats, saying and teaching sometimes the right things, but not doing it themselves. They went after seemingly God, but then missed everything that God was putting in their path. So he says, watch out for their teaching. Be aware of them. Understand that they're not quite what they claim to be. Watch out for that. So that's what he was talking about. But Jesus then goes on to kind of give them two lessons, if you like, here. One was like, what are you talking about, bread? That's not really what I'm talking about. So Jesus taught spiritual lessons here through everyday things like yeast. Great example there for teaching, using everyday things that people are familiar with to teach spiritual principles. But they weren't getting it. They weren't understanding what he was talking about. Do you still not see or understand? So he was addressing the fact that he didn't understand what he was saying now about the meaning of yeast not being bread as such, look a bit deeper. But then he also reflected back on their faithlessness regarding, why are you worried about only having one bit of bread anyway? Did I not just feed the 5,000 and the 4,000? And he says to them, because their mind's going with, "Oh no, we forgot to bring bread except for one loaf. Oh no, we don't have enough here." So they're worried they don't have enough. And Jesus is like, "Do you have eyes but fail to see? Do you not remember what I've just done in feeding 4,000 and 5,000 groups of people? Um, and don't you remember?" He says to them, "Don't you remember?" Do you not remember? Then he goes on to say about how many basketfuls did you pick up? And then they explained and told him. He says to them, "Don't you remember?" And this is critical point here. Don't you remember? Jesus expected them to remember the past miracles. He expected them to remember God displayed in their life, to remember God's past faithfulness. It doesn't matter if you're short this time because I showed you what happened last time. Why do you worry about how we're going to feed these people when you know and seen what I've done before? Jesus expected faith. He expected them to do better here. Why? Because of what they've already seen before. And I think this is exactly the same for you and me. We've got to remember God's past faithfulness. We've got to remember what He's done before in order to help us in the future and to help us now. And it's exactly the same thing shared in so many different scriptures, but you'll see it in Deuteronomy 4, verse 9. God is warning the people as they go into the promised land. He says, look, be careful and watch yourselves closely so that you do not forget the things your eyes have seen or let them slip from your heart as long as you live. Teach them to your children and to their children after them. It says, remember the day you stood before the Lord your God at Horeb. And he went on to explain that the mountain was ablaze. How could you forget this? Why would he need to tell them to remember this? But he did. He had to say, look, your hearts will forget this. It's hard to believe, isn't it? Incredible things that God does in your life, miraculous events, and yet you can forget them. Jesus warned about it. He said it to his followers, and God has said here in the Old Testament as well. Now, just a little bit of help for us in terms of how can I keep remembering the incredible things God has done. As much as we think, how could I forget? We might forget. Jesus says God says here in Deuteronomy chapter 4, a really good part at the end, says, don't let these things slip from your heart as long as you live. So it's not just about remembering today or next week, it's about remembering as long as you live. But he says in verse 9 here, teach them to your children and to their children after them. I think this is a big thing that we can do in order to help us not forget. It says, teach them here to your children and to their children after them. You've created a culture in your life where you pass on what God has done. And I think I just said three things come to my mind that we will do with God's past miracles. Things that God has done. We will talk about them, we will teach about them, and we'll pass them on. I think that's a surefire way to help us not forget. Well, it's on our heart, first of all. We want to talk about it, but it means we don't forget. And those around us, would those around us say they know about the miracles that God's done in our life? Would those around us know, do they know the miraculous things that God's done in their life? That's a really good question to ask, and I'll see how we would answer it. But it helps me today because one of the things I feel called to is get out and share my faith with more people. Help people to see God's truth in Scripture. Get talking to people. And sometimes I can feel like, but people don't want to know. It's today's culture. They're apathetic and uninterested. I know the responses I'm going to get and so on and so forth. And one of the things I can remember there that helps me immensely with this, and God reminds me of this every time I feel like that, is my wife today and my children have came about through me going and sharing my faith with someone who was lost. I helped my wife's brother become a Christian many, many years ago, reached out to him on the street, shared my faith with him. Didn't really feel like it at the time, didn't feel like continuing to study with him, but we did that. He became a Christian, and then as a result, his sister came along, he became my wife, I became a stepdad, and I had my own children. So incredible things happen. God is faithful, and that's an event that really helps me to remember God's past faithfulness. So just like Jesus said to his followers, do you not remember? We must remember the incredible things that God has done. What has this brought about in your mind? What memory have you got? What's your favorite memories? Maybe we need to write them down. But remember, one thing we can do is to talk about these miracles, teach about them, and then pass them on to others. Please share this on today. Please like if you like this helped you in any way today. Please share it on for others. Please subscribe to that Bible Guy, and let's get his word out there.